Well, you may wonder why we got this here this morning. I want to talk about had a really busy day, and what I like most, I love to sit down and make a nice pot of tea. Now, I had problems this morning, because at first I couldn't find the extension, then I couldn't find the kettle. When I found the kettle, it doesn't work. But we're here with the kettle. I've made a nice cup of tea, and I have my favourite mug at home. I like my China mug. So there's my China mug. Nice, not too much milk. We all like our tea slightly different, don't we? And then a nice, decent brew of tea. Now, my favourite thing to have with a cup of tea, what I love the most, is to dunk a ginger biscuit. So anybody else wants to come and have a little dunk in a minute? Not yet. In a minute. Or, I don't usually have them at home, but somebody actually spoilt me this morning. I have a chocolate. So we could perhaps share those in a minute, couldn't we, and have a chocolate. All right. Now, I want to ask you, what do you love the most, Cameron? What's the thing you like the very best, you love?
Chocolate.
Chocolate. Chocolate cake?
Yeah.
Yeah. How about you, Alfie?
Pizza.
Pizza.
Yes. High five, Alfie.
John Paul.
My family.
Your family. That's a good one. Aww. You're ruining my talk, you are.
Video game.
Video games. Now, I know somebody over here who for supper has something they really love. Colin? No. Stopped it, have you?
Cheese and pickled onions.
Cheese and pickled onions. Anybody else got anything they really desperate to tell me that they love? Oh, let somebody else have a little turn first. Anybody else?
Up here.
Carly, yes? Oh, sorry, Mary.
Dairy on toast.
Dairy on toast, yes. Yes? I'll hold it.
Nothing, because I love all things equally.
Oh, that's a really good answer too. You're ruining my sermon. Anybody else got something they love? Yes. Yes, Jean.
Jean's Cornish pasties.
Wonderful. Yes, Toby.
Rugby round.
Big shout down
Burger.
Burgers. Oh, there we are. So we've had lots of things we love. We use the word love a bit easily, really, don't we? And the word love is actually a very passionate, strong, important word. So we don't really love my cup of tea. I don't hug it and get all embraced with it, but I really like it, or I really enjoy it. I don't particularly love it in a passionate way. But there's some person writes songs, the famous Beatles song, "Love is All I Need," is a really good one, isn't it? Yes, Henry? Go on then.
All you need is love. All together now. All you need is love. Love.
Love.
Is a holiday.
Brilliant. But I want us to think about a very special love this morning, and I want you to think about this all next week. God sent his only son because he so loved us and cared about each one of us to forgive us. But not only that, he gave us the biggest commandment ever. Love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself. That doesn't mean put up with them because you maybe ought to, or tolerate them, or it says love. And love, if we are Christians, means going that extra bit and giving that extra bit of love. Thank you.
Our reading, which I always remind you has not been picked by me, because I always seem to get a bit of a corker. is from Luke 17, and it's from verse 5 through to verse 10. And can I just say, let your feelings be genuine as we read this, because sometimes we have to feel what we feel, because Jesus often used that as a way of kind of, in a good sense, provoking people in their emotions to think about what he's been saying. So you may understand that as I read it, but let your emotions just accept what they're kind of saying to you. The apostles said to the Lord, "Increase our faith." He replied, "If you have faith as small as a mustard seed, you can say to this mulberry tree, 'Be uprooted and planted in the sea,' and it will obey you. Suppose one of you had a servant ploughing or looking after the sheep. Would he say to the servant when he comes in from the field, 'Come along now and sit down to eat'? Would he not rather say, 'Prepare my supper, get yourself ready, wait on me while I eat and drink, and after that you may drink'? Would he thank the servant because he did what he was told to do? So you also, when you have done everything you were told to do, should say, 'We are unworthy servants, we have only done our duty.'" Does that bless your heart? And if you say yes, I wonder if you've been thinking with your emotions, or you've been thinking with your kind of spiritual mind that says so. There's some harsh words amongst there, aren't there? And to get into it, I just wonder, that first verse we read, the apostles said to the Lord, "Increase our faith." I just don't get the feeling that they woke up one morning and had a bit of a chatter over their first coffee of the day, saying, "Shall we ask him about increasing our faith?" You kind of got a sense, haven't you, that something happened that made them think, we're struggling to keep up with that. Our faith doesn't stretch to that. And so I want to read to you the verses before it. Last time I was here, I was preaching later on in Luke, but I said to you, Luke is very good. He tips us off very neatly, alternating between Jesus speaking to his disciples and those who were not his disciples. And that's a big clue to understanding things. In the flow, if you're on the church Bibles, page 1051, Luke 16 starts, Jesus told his disciples. And then in verse 14 of that chapter, it says, the Pharisees who loved money heard all this and were sneering at Jesus. He said to them. So he's moved to talk to the Pharisees, and he has a different approach, a different tone. And then in chapter 17, where we are this morning, verse 1 says, Jesus said to his disciples. So he's come back, he's speaking to his disciples now, and when the disciples say, Lord, increase our faith, this doesn't seem to be working, Tim. My lights are on, but there's nobody at home. So is that you doing that? Okay. Is that the first slide? Yeah? Okay. I thought it said increase our faith. But anyway, when they say increase our faith, I think it's on the back of what Jesus says to the disciples from verse 1. So although it's not part of the reading this morning, I hope you will see that this sets the clue to solving some of the emotional dilemmas of these verses. Jesus said to his disciples, things that cause people to sin are bound to come, but woe to that person through who they come. It would be better for him to be thrown into the sea with a millstone tied round his neck than for him to cause even one of these little ones to sin. So watch yourselves. Jesus is in a serious mood here. I don't mean that disrespectfully. And he's just said to them, things that cause people to sin will come, but make sure you're not the one who causes these things to happen. Because in modern language, Jesus says, you'd be better off sticking your finger in a power socket When he says to them in their world, better to have a millstone around your neck. That's a kind of cartoony picture because I couldn't find a real one of where somebody put a millstone around somebody's head and then chucked them in some water. Because that's pretty macabre language, isn't it? That's what Jesus is saying. But the bit that's quite interesting to me, that's better. We missed it a bit there. The question marks are supposed to be a little logo of a turnaround, 2 arrows, a bit like on a CD player or something where you kind of randomly choose. Because what I'm going to show in all this, wherever you see those 2 question marks, the graphic hasn't obviously come through. But that's a switch around. And what Jesus does in these verses, he switches the attention around. Now, if I said to you that somebody has sinned in this church, but actually I happen to know because they came to me in confidence and told me that you caused them to do it, and therefore it's your fault. And if you don't sort it out, we may as well just put your finger in a power socket. I think you wouldn't be saying, praise the Lord, thank you, brother, for your honesty. You'd be saying, I'm horrified that you're blaming me for their sin. Well, that's what Jesus is talking about here. And he says that there's a serious issue here, and you've got to keep up with Jesus when he's saying some serious things. Sin and failure are bound to come, but make sure that you don't cause other people to fall into this. And this grotesque picture that you are the one who will have the millstone tied around your neck and thrown into the sea, then, and he's talking to his disciples, he switched the attention in what I think is a quite harrowing way to say to me, you make sure you don't cause other people to sin. So he switches the attention from the sinner to the one who's caused them to sin. And this is not an optional extra for the more committed follower. It is baseline, foundation teaching of life in his kingdom. You are not out to provoke people, to upset people, to cause them to sin. You are out to build each other up. And when Jesus says, you will forgive, I like the New International Version and I read from it a lot, but it does not capture the full sense of where Jesus says, if your brother sins, forgive him. If he sins against you 7 times, and 7 times come back to you and says, I repent, our church Bibles say, forgive him. That's just a kind of statement, forgive him. What Jesus said was what we, if you can remember your school grammar, the imperative sense, which is a verb said as a command. He says to them, if somebody comes to you, 7 times repents, you will forgive. Not have a go at it. Not forgiveness is the thing we do, It is a command. You will forgive. No ifs, no buts. Now, I think we probably are as offended by that today when we strip aside what we know we should believe, as Jesus' disciples were when he said to them, 7 times they come, 7 times you'll forgive. You probably know that the Jewish background to all this was a bit like a baseball game, really. 3 strikes and you're out. 3rd time you've forgiven somebody, no more. Before God, I have no responsibility to forgive you again. So when it was 7, of course, it was hyper generous, not 3. And Jesus is saying, you will forgive. Now, I'm not essentially here to talk about those verses, but it's a foundational thing. And I think, and I hope you'll understand why I say this, I think that is precisely why the disciples said to Jesus, increase our faith. You are asking a tall order on us. This is more than we can imagine. How can I forgive somebody who has done something horrific? Possibly even to me. Or I've seen them do something horrific to somebody else. And so the command, you will forgive, I think, is the thing, the catalyst that causes them to say, we're going to have more faith than this. And yet, notice how Jesus turns everything round. So the apostles said to Jesus, increase our faith. And Jesus replied, if you have faith as small as a mustard seed, you can say to this tree, be uprooted and planted in the sea, and it will obey you. You notice, have you ever thought about it? They are asking for more faith, and Jesus says what you need is less faith. Now it really is confusing, isn't it? He's just told us we might as well stick our fingers in the sockets, and then says you need little faith. Well, I think most of us would need a fair dose of faith to stick our fingers in a socket and think that maybe Jesus will protect me. And I'm not suggesting you try it. But so they get that. They say increase our faith, and Jesus switches it round to saying what you need is not more faith, you need less faith. How can that work out? And he says a tiny amount of power can move a tree and cast it into the sea. That's the analogy that he's looking at. How much faith do you need to literally uproot a tree? You don't need very much. It's what you put the faith in. So if I said to you, do you think the tree in your garden could blow down today? If it's a lovely, still, sunny day as it is today, you probably think there's not much. I've got no faith that the tree's going to blow over today. If it was a day or two back when we'd got raging winds, you probably would have said, I've got faith to believe today that tree could blow over. I'm a bit worried about it. I'm not going out in the garden because I think it could be a serious incident. So it's not the amount of faith you've got in the tree blowing over. It's the faith you've got in the strength of the wind. That's what it is, isn't it? And Jesus says, you only need a tiny bit of faith if you put it in the right place. And whilst they were thinking, we have got to build up some mighty faith to obey you, Jesus says, you don't need a massive faith. You need a tiny bit of faith in a massive force. What is that force? It is God's power. Paul later on would write, I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength. They don't need greater faith. They need tiny faith in a great God. That's what they needed. That's all they needed. So once again, Jesus switches the attention from the disciples having more faith to a little bit of faith in a mighty God. And folks, I hope that's starting to turn us round to encouragement with what Jesus is talking about here. It's not built on us magnifying our faith and almost like a weightlifter, taking in enough and having all the right things to make us strong and build up our muscles. And sometimes as Christians, we live in the false notion that the more we get built up as Christians, the stronger we'll be for God. That's nonsense. The truth of the matter is, just a tiny little bit of faith in the almighty power of God is all it takes. And that's not me. Don't argue with me, because that's what Jesus is saying here. It's not building us up to be massive warriors of faith. It's having a mustard seed of faith in our mighty God. And so Jesus once again switches the attention, but not forgetting the cause, i.e. forgiveness, and how many times you forgive each other. And you're probably sat there thinking, well, there's somebody who agitates me so much in church, or my neighbour, or somebody, a Christian in the past, and I've forgiven them so many times and they never change, and I've just run out. Well, the truth of the matter is, you've only run out of trying to magnify your faith enough to do it, when actually you just need a minuscule of faith in a mighty God to give you the power to forgive and move on. And you may be sat here this morning having spent a lifetime just not getting over some letdown by some Christian who has hurt you, maybe even decades ago. And you're just thinking, I've not got enough faith to do that. Well, maybe Jesus says you need to reduce your faith, but make it into a big, powerful God who gives you the strength to do whatever. So I think we're starting to get a more sensible understanding of what's going on here with Jesus. And that all sets the scene for this tiny couple of lines parable that Jesus uses about a servant. And it's this story that the servant's out ploughing in the fields or looking after the sheep, and then he comes in, and Jesus asks the question after the statement, "Come along now and sit down to eat. Would he not rather say, prepare my supper? Get yourself ready, wait on me, eat and drink." And again, it looks like a kind of harsh little story, doesn't it, about Jesus just flogging you back with the whip that you've got to carry on. And I don't know, if you feel free if you want to, just say out in one word, what emotion strikes you with Jesus' little parable here? Does it make you feel warm? Or does it make you feel a bit kind of afraid about Jesus? You don't get feelings of kind of, this is a cozy parable that Jesus is telling me he loves me. It's a kind of parable that I've got to work harder somehow. I've never done enough. And, I can't get through to the end where he says, well done, good and faithful servant. It's all kind of, you've got more to do. And at the end of it, we're unworthy servants. We have only done our duty. Well, just notice how Jesus switches his listeners around in this particular one. Look how he says, suppose you had a servant. So Jesus puts them in the position of being masters. Now, you probably feel a bit more comfortable about that. We're just trained in our lives and our world that we'd rather be masters than slaves. Probably can't even use that word in society these days, or servants. And Jesus gets them to think, if you were the master, what would you expect? If you're a business leader, you expect people to do what you've paid them to do. And of course they fall straight into it, because we all do, because we like to be masters. And then he turns it round and he says, when you have done everything. So in other words, he gets them to think about being a master, and then he says, actually, in my kingdom, none of you will be masters. I don't require any other masters. The whole point is that I'm the master, you're following me. So he suddenly turns it all around and reminds them that they are followers. They were never called to be masters. And you and I, whether you sat in the proverbial pew or me behind the proverbial pulpit, none of us are masters. We're all servants of Jesus. But that still leaves us with this little kind of pain in our swallowing of what Jesus said. We're all unworthy servants. We have only done our duty. Now, if we hook all this together, what is Jesus saying here? First of all, he's saying you've got to forgive, forgive, forgive. Even if it's your responsibility to deal with things. Then he tells the disciples, you don't need more faith to do this. It's my command that you do it. And whatever I command you to do, I empower you to do. So if I say you will forgive, you will forgive. And when you say we need more faith to live up to that, you don't need more faith. You need a faith in a great God. And when he says at the end, you have only done your duty, what I think he's saying is, even in forgiving time after time, 7 times a day, 7 days a week with the same person, you have only done your duty because it's the essential of your Christian walk to forgive, to restore, to move on. So I don't think this is a general statement about Jesus, about cracking the whip more and get on with more and more. He's saying, what I call you to do, I will always empower you to do. So, in the words of a not quite so new book now, feel the fear and do it anyway. We all have a bit of resistance when it comes to forgiveness. If we want it from somebody else, we need it. We have to demand it. Please forgive me. But that behoves each one of us the other side of the equation. When people sin against us, it is our business, with danger of electrocution if we don't, that we forgive and we forget. So I want to ask you in closing, and particularly as we come to communion, how strong is your faith in God? He doesn't want it to be massive. It only needs to be tiny. But faith in your great God. And if you're sat here thinking this morning, I could never forgive that person for what they've done to me, I want to say to you in the name of Jesus, you can. You will. Because you must. And that will liberate you into exactly what the disciples wanted. We need more faith. You'll find you've got more faith. Not because you've increased the magnitude of your faith, but because you realize how big God is. I'm not going to give you details for obvious reasons, but over my years of ministry, there are some people I've looked at and I've talked to privately and personally, hence I can't give any details. And I've said to them, you have got to forgive. Knowing in my own heart, thinking, if I were in your shoes, I don't know how I would do that. Humanly speaking, I'm not a hypocrite in what I'm saying now about what I've said to them, but in my spirit, I know that they have to do it. I would have to do it if I were in their position. So I understand the human frailty, but with all my heart and soul, I will say to people, you have to forgive, even if you didn't do it, because that is your duty. And then, like the disciples, you'll see faith rising, but not rising in you. Faith in your mighty God. Feel the fear. Do it anyway. Be forgiving people. Be people of restoration. And indeed, that is exactly what we come to when we come to the communion service. Let's move on to that, but keep those thoughts in our minds as we come to communion, that we have a forgiving God, and he gives us the power to become forgiving people.